Across oceans older than mountains, life shimmered in forms almost unrecognizable to us, trilobites, crawling through dim seas, coral cities rising in silence. Continents drifted like restless giants across a planet still learning its rhythm. Forests took their first breath, and creatures tested the strength of bone against gravity. It was an age of invention and annihilation, where life rebuilt itself again and again beneath changing skies. To understand the Paleozoic is to witness Earth discovering what it means to be alive, a story written in stone, waiting to be remembered, the world before life. Oceans of fire, skies of ash. The world begins not with colour, but with heat. The early Paleozoic Earth still bears the scars of its violent youth continents, fractured by magma plumes, oceans steaming with chemical potential, and an atmosphere heavy with carbon dioxide and sulfur. Where today's sky is blue, this one glowed copper and dim. Ultraviolet light pierced the gases, and horizons shimmered in perpetual haze. Beneath it, molten rock hardened into basalt plains, and the first continental fragments, Laurentia, Baltica, Gondwana, drifted like blackened rafts across a simmering sea. Geologists read this world through the language of minerals. Zircon crystals from Australia show that crust had formed billions of years before, but by 541 million years ago, the planet had stabilized. Rhodinia's breakup scattered land masses into a global ocean, while sediments preserved iron-rich waters under an oxygen-poor sky. These shallow basins, where sunlight touched mineral-laden seas, became crucibles of chemistry. Volcanic ridges exhaled hydrogen sulfide and methane into the deep. Along those hydrothermal vents, heat and minerals created gradients that powered reactions. Iron-sulfur compounds trapped energy and built complex carbon molecules, precursors to metabolism. Modern vent fields, such as Lost City, mirror these conditions, offering glimpses of how inorganic matter rehearsed the patterns of life. The planet itself was the first laboratory. The continents above were barren. Winds carried dust across dark rock. Rain, acidic with carbonic compounds, carved primitive rivers that returned minerals to the sea. Over millions of years, chemical weathering drew carbon dioxide from the air, acting as a planetary thermostat. Isotopic analyses of ancient rocks suggest that this carbon silicate cycle stabilized the climate enough for life to persist when it appeared. If the land was lifeless, the sea was stirring. In the preceding Ediacaran period, multicellular organisms like Dickinsonia and Charniodiscus had carpeted the seafloor soft-bodied forms that absorbed nutrients through skin-thin membranes. By the Paleozoic's opening, most vanished, replaced by smaller, more adaptable species. Oxygen levels were shifting. New ecological pressures favoured innovation. Their disappearance marked a quiet reset before evolution's greatest acceleration. The oceans recorded that transformation in colour. As oxygen increased, dissolved iron precipitated out, settling into red hematite bands that today streak cliffs in Australia and Canada. These rocks mark the great oxygenation's later equilibrium, a chemical revolution sustained by cyanobacteria. Through photosynthesis, they enriched the seas with oxygen, enabling aerobic metabolism and the architecture of future animals. But oxygen is also destroyed. Anaerobic species retreated into dark sediments, where fossils now reveal filamentous colonies, the faintest echoes of microbial mats that once ruled shallow tides. To the eye, those environments would have seemed mineral rather than biological. Rippling films of green slime hardening into stone beneath shifting light. Volcanoes continued to define the skyline, venting gases that alternately cooled and warmed the planet. Layers of ash, preserved in marine sediments, formed datable markers of these eruptions, helping geologists reconstruct the rhythm of instability. Outgassing fed carbon dioxide to the air, while weathering locked it away again, the earliest feedback loop of climate control. The Earth, long before awareness, was already self-regulating. Despite a fainter sun, the greenhouse blanket of methane and carbon dioxide kept oceans liquid. Models show how this balanced the solution to the faint young sun problem: sustained surface warmth. A minor change in volcanic activity might have plunged Earth into ice, yet equilibrium held. In that narrow margin between fire and frost, habitability endured. Deep below, tectonic movement reshaped the planet. Seafloor spreading created new crust, while subduction consumed the old, slowly rearranging continents. Magnetic patterns, frozen in ancient basalt, confirm this drift, revealing how early ocean basins opened and closed. Each rift formed new habitats, and each collision sculpted future coastlines. Even before complex life, geology was orchestrating evolution's stage. Lightning cut across the copper sky, forging nitrates essential for organic chemistry. Rain carried them into the ocean, where they fed reactions at hydrothermal vents. Laboratory experiments show that such discharges can synthesize amino acids, suggesting that every storm may have contributed to life's raw ingredients. The planet's restlessness was not destruction, it was preparation. To human imagination, this would have seemed a world of noise: no birds, no wind through leaves, only the hiss of steam and the crash of water against molten rock. The silence we associate with lifelessness did not exist here. It was a soundscape of pressure, fire, and vapor, a planet rehearsing the rhythm of respiration before lungs or gills evolved to hear it. Over tens of millions of years, the fever eased. Carbon dioxide concentrations declined. Skies lightened from ochre to pale blue. Sedimentary records show rising levels of calcium carbonate, evidence that oceans had steadied to near-modern salinity. In these calmer waters, microscopic plankton began forming thin shells of aragonite and calcite. Fossils from the early Cambrian reveal these earliest biomineralized structures, signaling that the line between chemistry and biology was dissolving. The Earth of this moment, though hostile by human measure, carried all the instructions for what would follow. Volcanoes forged the elements of protein, lightning sparked organic chains, and ocean currents distributed the chemistry of beginnings. To picture it is to see energy learning from matter, becoming memory. The planet, once molten and indifferent, was preparing to awaken. Beneath the waves, a revolution in respiration was unfolding. Early fish refined their gills to draw oxygen more efficiently from the water, adapting to the fluctuating chemistry of Paleozoic seas. Some, like Dunkleosteus, evolved armored jaws, capable of exerting enormous bite forces, redefining predator-prey dynamics. At the same time, tiny plankton blooms enriched marine oxygen, setting the stage for later atmospheric shifts. These evolutionary experiments, microscopic and monstrous alike, would ripple across the epochs, priming life for its boldest step, the conquest of land. Soon, the haze will clear. The seas, once dark and sterile, will bloom with movement and colour. The ancient silence will give way to the first pulse of life, and Earth will shift from a world of reaction to a world of intention, the long, deliberate beginning of complexity. The Cambrian bloom, when life invented itself anew. From the calm of cooling seas, motion began to stir faint ripples, signalling the first restless currents of life. The planet that had once roared with volcanic fury now breathed in quiet rhythm, its waters enriched with oxygen from ancient microbial mats. Within these shallows, chemistry became choreography. Molecules that had once drifted without purpose now assembled with intent, forming membranes, tissues, and shapes never before seen beneath the sun. In less than a geological instant, the stillness fractured into movement, and the Earth entered its first biological dawn, the Cambrian explosion. In the shallows of newly oxygenated oceans, strange organisms drifted like fragments of a dream still learning to take shape. Their bodies glowed faintly in filtered light, translucent and vulnerable. Trilobites scuttled across soft sediments, their faceted eyes scanning the darkness for food or danger, while worm-like creatures tunneled beneath, leaving traces that marked the beginning of animal behavior. These early seas were alive with invention, every ripple carrying new forms of sensation and defense. What had taken eons to prepare oxygenation, stability, nutrient cycles, now unleashed an evolutionary storm. Within a few million years, nature's palette exploded, crafting shells, eyes, and segmented limbs from what had once been shapeless forms. Fossil beds like the Burgess Shale in Canada and the Chengjiang deposits in China preserve this miracle in extraordinary detail. Soft-bodied creatures immortalized by chance, their organs and spines imprinted in stone. Here lie Opabinia with its 5 eyes and grasping trunk, Hallucigenia with its spines like inverted thorns, Wiwaxia with scales that shimmered like metal armor. Each fossil speaks not of random chaos, but of organized experimentation, a world testing the very grammar of biology. As light filtered through clearer waters, vision evolved, and with it came the arms race between hunter and prey. The first predators, such as Anomalocaris, grew sleek and agile, their compound eyes boasting tens of thousands of lenses, capable of tracking movement with precision. Prey species responded in kind, developing thicker shells, faster reflexes, and defensive spines. This feedback loop, attack and adaptation, marked one of the most transformative moments in evolution's history. For the first time, survival was not merely endurance, but awareness. Life had learned to see, and in doing so, it had learned to compete. Across vast reefs, trilobites, sponges, and worm-like burrowers began carving micro-worlds into the seafloor, reshaping sediments with their movement. The oceans became structured ecosystems, their layers defined by light, temperature, and hunger. Filter feeders occupied the upper zones, while detritus eaters scoured the benthic plains. Microbial mats, once dominant across the seabed, were grazed into decline by these new animals, the first true engineers of the biosphere. Sediment studies reveal how their burrows oxygenated the ocean floor, transforming stagnant zones into living landscapes. The simple act of movement became a geological force. Each adaptation was both an invention and a risk, for every success redrew the boundaries of survival in these crowded seas. Genetic studies suggest that many of these changes were guided by an ancient toolkit, the Hox genes, shared across nearly all modern animals. This modular system allowed nature to rearrange its blueprints, repurposing limbs, eyes, and sensory structures into countless variations. Through such molecular flexibility, complexity emerged at breathtaking speed. Evolution was no longer a slow drift, but a cascade, an interlocking series of creative acts that redefined the possibilities of life. The Cambrian seas also bore the first architects of the vertebrate lineage. Among them swam Picaia gracilens, a slender, ribbon-like creature from the Burgess Shale that possessed a notochord, a flexible rod that hinted at the future spine. In China's Chengjiang deposits, Hycoichthys displayed primitive vertebrae and gill structures, marking the earliest steps toward the fish that would one day rule the oceans. These tiny forms, barely a few centimeters long, carried within them the blueprint for all creatures with backbones, from amphibians to mammals, and ultimately to us. The vertebrate story had begun in silence, among predators that could not yet imagine the continents above. In these ancient waters, ecosystems achieved a delicate complexity never before seen. Stromatolites, the layered microbial reefs that once dominated Earth's coastlines, waned as animal grazers diversified. Calcium carbonate precipitated into shells, locking atmospheric carbon into the seafloor and gradually stabilizing the global climate. Ocean chemistry shifted. New feedback loops emerged between biology and geology. The living Earth, once driven solely by volcanic and chemical processes, now pulses with ecological cycles. Life itself had become a planetary force, shaping currents, sediments, and climate through its collective metabolism. Beneath the waves, biogeochemical change rewrote the planet's destiny. Oxygen levels continued to climb, supported by photosynthetic plankton that flourished in nutrient-rich shallows. Fossilized microplankton from the late Cambrian show intricate silica shells and carbon isotope signatures that mark this expansion of primary productivity. These minute organisms, invisible to the naked eye, formed the base of food webs that sustained trilobites and other larger species. With each breath of oxygen produced, the oceans became more dynamic, the skies above them more life-sustaining. The stage was being set for colonization beyond the sea. Yet the Cambrian bloom was not without loss. Many early experiments vanished almost as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind ghost lineages and unanswered questions. The fossil record records several pulses of extinction, subtle contractions following each wave of innovation. Ecologists call this the boom and bust rhythm of early evolution, when ecosystems outgrew their own stability. But even in loss, progress persisted. The survivors carried with them lessons etched in anatomy, stronger shells, more efficient metabolism, refined senses. Nature was learning through attrition, perfecting complexity through crisis. In the waning light of this ancient sea, evolution found its tempo invention, followed by balance, chaos tempered by pattern. Over tens of millions of years, the Cambrian world settled into a living mosaic of predators and prey, builders and scavengers, swimmers and burrowers. Each niche hummed with activity, each organism both product and participant of its environment. This was life's first great flourishing, a moment when the earth itself seemed to awaken to its own potential. By the time the seas cleared from this biological tempest, life had already learned the art of dominance. Eyes, limbs, nerves, and shells had rewritten what it meant to exist. The ocean floor, once a barren expanse, now teemed with diversity, the first real expression of ecological order. And yet, this was only the beginning. In the silence between waves, the planet waited for its next transformation, when life would rise from water to claim the land itself. Kingdoms of the shallow sea. As the frenzy of Cambrian creation subsided, the oceans settled into order tranquil shallows, where life began to build rather than simply survive. Sunlight, once scattered by volcanic haze, now streamed through clear waters, illuminating vast carbonate platforms along the edges of new continents. These seas were neither empty nor chaotic. They pulsed with quiet architecture life, constructing permanence upon the bones of the earth. Sediments stabilized, shorelines extended, and reefs took hold where the world's pulse beat slow and sure. Along continental margins, reefs of early corals and stromatoporoids rose from the seabed, anchoring the first enduring architectures of life. Fossil records from sites such as Anticosti Island and the Baltic Basin reveal these Ordovician reefs spanning kilometers, composed of tabulate and rugose corals bound together by calcifying algae. In their limestone skeletons, scientists find the oldest examples of biological engineering ecosystems capable of reshaping entire coastlines. These structures captured light, oxygen, and nutrients, transforming turbulent shallows into thriving sanctuaries. Currents carried nutrients from deep waters to sunlit zones, feeding immense plankton blooms that painted the Ordovician seas with shifting veils of green and gold. Oxygen levels reached near-modern concentrations, and with this atmospheric transformation, productivity soared. Microscopic phytoplankton, especially acritarchs, multiplied in staggering abundance, forming the base of food webs that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Carbon isotope data from marine shales reveal fluctuations tied to these algal pulses, signals of a living ocean that breathed in rhythm with the planet's rotation. Within these living citadels, creatures of every form found place and purpose. Trilobites grazed, cephalopods hunted, and primitive fish learned the ways of motion. Trilobites alone numbered in the thousands of species, ranging from burrowers to swimmers, their complex eyes adapted to dim reefs and open shelves alike. Nautiloid cephalopods, the giants of their age, propelled themselves with jets of water, their conical shells curling toward predatory mastery. Nearby, jawless vertebrates, the earliest agnathans, drifted along currents, their armoured scales hinting at the long evolutionary arms race to come. The Ordovician Sea was a theatre of balance, predator and prey in dynamic, measured motion. As continents drifted and collided, shallow shelves multiplied, transforming global geography into a network of marine sanctuaries. Gondwana inched toward the South Pole, while Laurentia, Baltica, and Avalonia spun like slow-moving rafts in the tropical belt. Each collision or rift reshaped coastlines, flooding continental interiors and spawning epic eperic seas. Geological surveys of North American limestone reveal sedimentary layers, hundreds of meters thick, testimony to cycles of transgression and regression that sustained biodiversity. Climate modelling and isotope evidence suggest that equatorial waters warmed to over 30 degrees Celsius, while polar currents remained cool and nutrient-rich, driving powerful global circulation systems. Each ecological layer, from coral, polyp to apex predator, wove a web of energy so efficient that the seas themselves became engines of stability. Detritus sank to oxygen-poor depths, locking carbon in black shales that would one day fuel continents. Filter feeders, brachiopods, bryozoans, and crinoids colonized every niche, recycling nutrients and clarifying the water. It was a closed-loop system, nearly self-sustaining. Photosynthesis feeding grazers, grazers feeding hunters, and decomposers closing the circle. Scientists call this the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, 2A, 5 million year explosion of ecological complexity that multiplied known marine genera nearly five-fold. In reef cores drilled from western Newfoundland, paleontologists find microfossils layered with precision, each stratum a record of expansion and adaptation. Radiometric dating places these formations between 470 and 460 million years ago, marking a pivotal interval in ocean chemistry. Strontium isotope ratios indicate high carbonate saturation, while rare earth element data show stable oxygen levels extending to deep marine zones. The world had achieved equilibrium, a chemical and biological poise that allowed ecosystems to refine themselves rather than merely persist. For the first time, life was not reacting to change, but generating it. Across the globe, coral platforms mirrored this harmony. In the now frozen deserts of the Sahara, The fossilized remains of Ordovician reefs lie beneath dunes, evidence that northern Gondwana once shimmered beneath tropical seas. Stromatoporoids formed dense mounds, their layered growth patterns tracing annual temperature cycles like tree rings in stone. Each band reveals fluctuations of only 1 or 2 degrees, suggesting climate stability unmatched in the planet's early history. This constancy gave rise to cooperation, symbiotic partnerships between algae and coral, predator and scavenger, a living fabric woven tight against entropy. Yet even in this abundance, quiet signals of imbalance began to stir. Carbon isotope excursions recorded in Baltic limestones show subtle disruptions, brief intervals of cooling, and reduced productivity. Geologists interpret these as precursors to polar glaciation, as Gondwana's southward drift increased ice accumulation and altered oceanic circulation. The balance of warmth and nutrient flow, once perfect, began to tilt. Sediment cores from ancient continental shelves revealed drops in sea level exceeding 50 meters, enough to expose reef platforms and fragment shallow habitats. The very structures that made life thrive now left it vulnerable to collapse. But beneath the quiet rhythm of this flourishing world, unseen pressures were gathering, whispers of imbalance that would soon still the reefs forever. The Ordovician's golden light dimmed as temperatures fell, and the seas that had given life its first stability began to withdraw. Coral cathedrals, once radiant under equatorial suns, succumbed to the chill. The water that had birthed abundance turned opaque and still. In the hush that followed, the oceans held their breath, unaware that the first great silence in life's history was about to fall. The ice that stilled the sea. With the loss of coral habitats came a planetary cooling, a shift that signaled the approach of global ice. The world that had shimmered with Ordovician abundance found its edges tightening, its cycles faltering. Ocean currents slowed, and the pulse of the tropics weakened. From pole to equator, a subtle veil of chill began to spread. The same carbon dioxide that once fed luxuriant plankton blooms was being pulled from the air by weathering rocks and rising mountains. The planet's thermostat, delicate and untested, began to turn against its own creation. What began as an imbalance became a pattern. Winds shifting, rains fading, the seas withdrawing like breath before silence. At the heart of Gondwana, ice sheets thickened over millions of years, their weight pressing continents downward and drawing oceans away from the sunlit shallows. Vast glaciers advanced across what is now northern Africa and South America, grinding mountains into powder and dragging stones across bedrock. Each new snowfall reflected more sunlight into space, deepening the freeze in a spiral of brilliance and desolation. This was not a winter of seasons, but an age of stillness, a planetary contraction that transformed warm coastlines into deserts of glass. Sedimentary tillites, preserved in ancient rocks, record the slow crawl of ice across once living seas. Even the air itself grew thin and brittle, its moisture locked within the frozen continents. The planet seemed to hold its breath, waiting for warmth that would not return. Geochemical records, locked in the ratios of oxygen isotopes, reveal the planet's slow descent, a cooling of 5 to 7 degrees that remade the map of life. Carbon isotope excursions, sudden and steep, trace the imbalance between burial and release, carbon drawn into sediments faster than volcanoes could restore it. It was the feedback loop of deep time. As mountains eroded, silicate weathering drew carbon dioxide from the air, reducing the greenhouse effect and inviting the cold. This cycle, invisible yet relentless, bound the fate of every organism to chemistry written in stone. In strata across Siberia, the Andes, and the Sahara, these isotopic fingerprints remain the quiet testimony of a biosphere undone by its own success. Even the fossils tell the story in miniature. Shells thickened, growth rings slowed, and calcium carbonate recorded the stress of a dying ocean. Across the continental shelves, retreating waters stranded entire ecosystems, leaving coral forests exposed to air and trilobite nurseries fossilized mid-motion. The oceans had fallen by more than 100 meters, bearing reefs and tidal flats that had once thrived with color. Creatures adapted to shallow light found themselves marooned as coastlines collapsed. Even in deeper regions, sedimentation slowed. Life's scaffolding began to disintegrate. Brachiopods vanished in waves, graptolites dwindled, and bryozoans, once architects of reef and shelter, succumbed to the silence. In these layers, paleontologists find sudden absences where variety once pulsed a biological exhale, frozen in stone. The extinction unfolded not as an explosion, but as a long exhalation, the ocean's voice dimming until nothing answered. Yet the freeze did not strike evenly. The tropics, though cooler, remained islands of relative warmth refuges where certain lineages endured. Here, within narrow equatorial bands, primitive jawless fish, crinoids, and mollusks clung to survival. Sediment cores from these ancient latitudes reveal pockets of organic matter, traces of communities compressed between waves of advancing cold. It was within these sanctuaries that the foundations for later recoveries persisted. Evolution, momentarily slowed, did not stop. It simply hid beneath the weight of ice. In this way, the Ordovician crisis became not only a record of death, but of persistence, an experiment in endurance, written across the face of a frozen planet. In deeper waters, oxygen dwindled and carbon burial accelerated, suffocating the intricate webs that had only recently learned balance. The very process that cooled the planet, the drawdown of carbon, now deprived it of breath. Anaerobic bacteria took over the stagnant basins, releasing sulfur and methane in pulses that poisoned what remained. The collapse was total, a biosphere caught in the machinery of planetary feedback. Nearly 85% of marine species vanished in this slow apocalypse, an extinction both precise and merciless. The Ordovician world, with its coral cathedrals and trilobite processions, was erased not by violence, but by geometry and time. Yet even here, traces of endurance whisper through the dark record. The hardy survivors, crinoids, ostracods, and a few resilient brachiopods clinging to what little oxygen remained. They endured where others could not, foreshadowing the selective nature of life's persistence. When the ice reached its zenith, the continents huddled beneath glaciers, kilometers thick, and nearly 85% of marine species were gone. A silence so complete it redrew the boundaries of evolution itself. The Earth had entered its first great reckoning, testing whether life could survive the weight of its own complexity. Yet even within the stillness, traces of resilience persisted. Beneath the frozen crust, microbial mats endured, feeding on the faint warmth of the seafloor. Volcanic eruptions began to breathe carbon dioxide back into the air, and over thousands of years, the equilibrium tilted once more. Slowly, the glaciers began to wane. Meltwater carved channels through ice, flooding the lowlands in sudden torrents. The seas, once retreated, returned to reclaim their beds, carrying new nutrients from the land. The glaciers retreated as slowly as they came, leaving scars in stone and silence in the sea. Yet beneath the melt, nutrients returned to the water, and surviving species began to stir. In the aftermath, evolutionary experiments took root. New coral lineages, armoured fishes, and early vertebrates poised to fill the vacant roles. Out of devastation came renewal, fragile yet determined. The ocean's chemistry, once unbalanced, began again to breathe. From devastation to recovery, new worlds emerged in the shadow of extinction. Out of loss emerged possibility, a fragile inheritance born from extinction's shadow. The age of armor. Fish rise from the depths. The retreat of the glaciers restored the oceans, allowing life to recolonize the coasts. And in those recovering waters, new forms evolved. The ocean, once stilled by ice, now shimmered with possibility. Nutrient-rich waters circulated again, sunlight cut through clearer depths, and oxygen levels rose. Out of the ruins of extinction came a slow stirring, a pulse, a shimmer, a ripple of bone beneath translucent flesh. The Silurian world was no longer a frozen aftermath, but a stage of experimentation where every organism seemed to test the boundaries of endurance. In the shallows, the first jawless fish ostracoderms drifted like living shields, their bodies encased in bone to protect against a world still uncertain. These creatures were both fragile and formidable, their armour a relic of fear and innovation intertwined. The oldest fossils, found in deposits like the Wenlock limestone of Britain, reveal intricate mosaics of dermal plates interlocking shields that glinted under ancient sunlight. They had no jaws, no true fins, and yet they endured. In the aftermath of a disaster, defense became the first art of survival. Over millions of years, evolution's experiments multiplied, giving rise to paired fins, cartilage skeletons, and the first whispers of predation. Fishes diversified into shapes and strategies that filled every ecological gap left by extinction. The once empty food chains became layered, again grazers, scavengers, hunters. The Silurian seas transformed into theatres of motion where every adaptation fed another. It was in these restless waters that the gill arches of early vertebrates began to change, forming the earliest prototypes of jaws, a transformation that would echo through every predator to come. Fossils from Silurian strata tell the story of this innovation in exquisite detail. In the Ludlow bone bed of England, paleontologists uncovered fragments of the first jawed fishes, primitive placoderms with bone plates fused into helmets and shoulder shields. Here, anatomy became destiny. Jaws meant choice, the ability to grasp, crush, and consume. With that single evolutionary leap, energy itself could flow differently through ecosystems. Predation was not merely aggression, it was an engine of complexity, forcing prey to adapt, coral reefs to grow denser, and mobility to refine itself through time. In reefs rebuilt from extinction's ruins, placoderms and acanthodians clashed in territories rich with life, each refinement of armour and motion an act of evolutionary art. Coral reefs of the Silurian, among the earliest complex ecosystems since the Cambrian, flourished once again, hosting an array of sponges, trilobites, mollusks, and the armoured pioneers that patrolled them. Some placoderms, like Dunkleosteus's ancestors, were sheathed in thick bone. Others, slender and agile, tested speed as an alternative to strength. The ocean became a proving ground of balance, of weight against mobility, protection against pursuit. Each generation etched the story of survival into its skeleton. Bone, once a passive material, became an active strategy, mineralized armor storing calcium, reinforcing muscle, defining structure. In these early vertebrates, we see the blueprint of all future motion. Their fins grew stronger, their spines more flexible, their tails capable of thrust. The Silurian seas were not static environments. They were dynamic laboratories, where every current sculpted anatomy and every failure left a fossil. Under the plates and fins, evolution learned delicacy, the art of order beneath might. Early vertebrates developed not just bony shields, but an axial support, the notochord, a flexible rod that anchored muscles and coordinated motion. Around it, the first true circulatory systems evolved to sustain active swimming, pumping oxygen through gills with greater efficiency. Even their senses sharpened primitive eyes adapted for dim reef light, and electroreceptive organs allowed them to detect the faintest vibrations in the water. Strength alone was no longer enough. Awareness itself became an instrument of survival. Sediment layers from this era preserve the tempo of recovery in astonishing fidelity. Isotopic data show that atmospheric oxygen levels had risen again, reaching near modern proportions, a transformation that fueled larger bodies and faster metabolisms. Coral reefs rebuilt the chemical stability of the ocean, filtering carbon, balancing nutrients, and creating microhabitats for the newly diverse life. It was a planetary symbiosis. As life evolved, it reshaped the very chemistry of its world. What began as defense soon became architecture ecosystems, building upon the bones of extinction. In the deeper waters, armored fish shared their domain with eurypterids sea scorpions nearly 2 meters long. These ancient predators prowled over the seafloor, challenging vertebrates to refine both speed and strategy. The arms race of evolution had begun. For the first time, the ocean's story was not only of endurance, but of power. Vertebrates learned to sense movement through lateral lines, to coordinate muscles with precision, and to strike and evade. The ocean, once a refuge from extinction, had become a crucible of invention. Across the Silurian world, continental drift redrew the map of life. The great landmasses Laurentia, Baltica, and Avalonia converged near the equator, forming new coastlines and shallows. Rivers poured minerals into tropical seas, feeding reefs and accelerating diversification. From Greenland to China, fossil beds record this bloom, the rise of armoured fish in every form and function. Some glided along reefs, others swam in open waters, their scales glittering in the dim green light. Evolution, like current, moved ceaselessly forward. Through their rise, vertebrates restructured marine ecosystems, stabilizing food webs, enriching oxygen levels, and driving energy into deeper waters. Where the Cambrian explosion had birthed variety, the Silurian revolution refined mastery. The blueprint of mobility and predation born here would echo into every oceanic age to come. Fish became the architects of marine ecosystems, each adaptation a collaboration with the planet's chemistry. In them, life began to take control of its own destiny. The armoured fish glided through sunlit waters, masters of a domain once frozen and silent. Yet every motion seemed to reach towards something beyond the glimmer of air above the surface, the promise of new worlds waiting in the shallows. Strength, once born of fear, now carries curiosity. The seas had given life its armour, its motion, its hunger, but the horizon offered something different, a place to climb, to breathe, to begin again. The story of life's conquest was not ending. It was gathering speed toward land. Green conquest, the march onto land, beyond the reach of tides. The world lay bare, a continent of stone and dust, untouched by breath or shadow. The seas had reclaimed their rhythm, but the land remained silent, a wilderness of rock waiting for transformation. Wind scoured the plains. Rivers traced new paths over barren slopes. Yet in the margins of these waters, in the shallow mud where tides once broke, the first signs of defiance stirred. Life, for the first time, reached beyond the sea. In damp hollows and river margins, the first moss-like plants clung to stone. They were fragile films of green, no higher than a fingertip, feeding on sunlight and mineral traces. These early colonizers, ancestors of liverworts and hornworts, formed mats that shimmered faintly in morning light, their cells swollen with possibility. They had no roots, no stems, no leaves, only the raw machinery of photosynthesis and the will to endure exposure. Yet from that simplicity came an alchemy, the conversion of rock and gas into sustenance. Spores drifted on the wind, fragile seeds of transformation that painted valleys in faint hues of life. Each grain carried the memory of water, a need for dampness, for shelter against the air's thin dryness. Over millions of years, these invisible travellers found purchase in cracks and gullies, spreading pigment across continents once monochrome. The fossil record captures their ghostly imprint, microscopic spores in ancient sediments dating to more than 430 million years ago, the first breath of the Silurian landscape. Beneath these pioneers, roots and fungal threads began to weave their alliance. Mycorrhizal fungi filaments, finer than a hair, infiltrated the rock beneath the green mats, trading minerals for sugars in a partnership older than forests themselves. Through this slow exchange, stone softened into soil, silicate minerals weathered under the gentle assault of organic acids, freeing nutrients and drawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The chemistry of continents shifted. Earth's crust, once inert, began to breathe. Soon, the air itself began to change. As photosynthetic mats thickened, oxygen rose across the planet's skies. Carbon dioxide declined, altering global temperature and climate feedbacks. Scientists trace this transformation through the isotopic fingerprints preserved in shale, the story of a planet learning to regulate its own air. For the first time, sunlight was trapped in cellulose and exhaled into the atmosphere as oxygen. The sky itself was no longer alien. It was becoming an extension of life. Along rivers and deltas, new species took form: Cooksonia, Rhynia, and the first true vascular plants. They stood upright, slender stalks branching into sporangia that released spores by the thousands. Within their stems flowed primitive vessels, xylem and phloem, allowing water to climb higher, defying gravity. Their appearance marked a biological revolution. For the first time, plants could build verticality, reaching toward light rather than crawling beneath it. The landscape, once a flat mosaic of algae and mats, began to rise. Over time, the colour deepened. Marshes glowed with greens and ochres. Nutrient-rich soils formed in layers, darkening with decay. Dead tissues accumulated, and decomposition forged the first detrital ecosystems, the beginnings of the carbon cycle on land. This quiet churning beneath the surface supported new microbial guilds, reshaping the chemistry of rivers that fed back into the seas. The web of life, once confined to salt water, now spanned the interface of rock, root, and rain. On this living crust, arthropods ventured ashore. Millipedes, scorpions, and centipedes traced cautious paths through the mossy expanse. Their exoskeletons gleamed with moisture. Their movements were slow, deliberate. The fossil Pneumodesmus pneumani, a tiny, segmented creature found in Scottish sandstone, preserves the first evidence of terrestrial breathing. Its spiracles, etched in stone, mark the threshold where respiration met air. These early pioneers grazed on decaying plant matter and algae, forming the first terrestrial food webs, fragile yet enduring. Through countless generations, the alliance between leaf and limb deepened. Insects would soon evolve from aquatic ancestors, adapting their tracheal systems to the open atmosphere. Arthropods diversified into hunters and detritivores, sculpting miniature ecologies amid the ferns and stems. The land's first ecosystems were intricate but low to the ground, a realm of damp soil, spores, and shadows, alive with the pulse of hidden motion. Life was still small, but the stage it claimed was immense. In the chemical archives of the Devonian, carbon isotopes record the consequences of this greening. As plants spread, the burial of organic carbon accelerated, cooling the global climate. The air thickened with oxygen, eventually surpassing modern levels, and fire became possible for the first time. Charcoal deposits appear in mid-Devonian strata, silent proof that the Earth had begun to breathe combustible air. With every hectare of greenery, the planet's metabolism expanded, binding energy into living matter and releasing it again in light and flame. Still, this conquest was slow, deliberate, and patient. Growth measured not in years, but in eons. Roots reached deeper, stabilizing sediments that once washed away with each storm. Riverbanks hardened, soil held. Continental interiors, long barren, began to harbour life in patches and corridors of green. The transformation was irreversible. The continents themselves had turned biological. What began as microscopic filaments had reshaped the face of the planet. In the hush of ancient wind, the continent shimmered with new colour, the first green earth. From moss to forest, from spore to sky, the silence had been broken by the soft persistence of life. Rock had learned to breathe, and air to nourish. And beneath the shallows, where vertebrates still watched the shore, the next ambition was forming. Soon, from this carpet of vegetation, bodies built for swimming would learn to walk, and the conquest of land would begin anew. Legs beneath the Sunday, where roots anchored and spores drifted, new shapes stirred in the shallows, creatures poised between two worlds. Beneath tangles of early vegetation, water shimmered with green light, heavy with decay and oxygen. Each ripple along the surface carried both promise and pressure. The land had been claimed by plants, but not yet by motion. Here, life hesitated at the threshold, muscles flexing against the pull of its own origin. The silence of ancient rivers was broken only by the stir of fins brushing silt, the faint thud of bone finding resistance. In these swamps, lobe-finned fish such as Eusthenopteron and Panderichthys began to test the boundaries of water and air. Their fins, dense with internal bones, pushed against sediment instead of current. Every movement left a brief indentation that gravity rushed to erase. When drought lowered the pools, they gasped in the humid air bodies, improvising between breath and suffocation. The shift was slow, but relentless. The architecture of motion itself was being rewritten. Where once evolution sculpted for fluidity, it now engineered for burden, teaching the skeleton to endure its own weight. Bones once meant for steering now bore weight humerus, radius, and ulna strengthening under strain. Cartilage thickened, joints fused for leverage. The subtle rotation of a wrist foreshadowed a hand. Each push forward was not yet a step, but something close, an experiment in endurance. The first vertebrates were learning what rock demanded tension, not buoyancy, resistance, not drift. As tides retreated and pools dried, the language of survival changed, movement translated into structure, the poetry of swimming rewritten as the grammar of walking. Lungs and nostrils, long present but secondary, grew vital as oxygen levels rose and stagnant waters thickened with decay. Internal choanae, the passage linking nose to mouth, allowed air to flow inward even when the head remained above the surface. Dual systems coexisted, gills for water, lungs for air, but balance was fragile. One storm, one drought, one shift of tide could determine which lineage endured. Evolution was breathing through two instruments, waiting to choose its dominant voice. And as Devonian forests thickened along deltas, photosynthesis fed the atmosphere, oxygen climbing toward 20%, a sky increasingly ready for breath. On floodplains of the late Devonian, Tiktaalik lifted its head above the surface, its fins acting as primitive limbs. Embedded in the silt of what is now Arctic Canada, it shows the compromise made flesh, scales on the body, wrists in the fins, lungs within the chest. Its eyes faced upward, its neck, newly flexible, allowed it to turn toward the horizon. This was anatomy reimagined for curiosity, the first gaze cast not through water but through air. In that moment, evolution seemed to look at itself, aware of distance, of direction, of sky. Fossil trackways from Poland and Greenland reveal that even before such forms, vertebrates had already taken steps, literal ones, across tidal flats. The imprints, pressed into 390 million-year-old mud, belong to creatures no longer wholly aquatic. Their movements suggest limbs capable of bearing weight, pushing through the resistance of land with purpose. The stride patterns show rhythm, not random flailing, the ghost of intention fossilized in silt. Long before bones learned perfection, intent had already arrived, and with it, a form of persistence that could no longer be drowned. In adapting to gravity, vertebrates rewrote their architecture. Ribs broadened to support lungs, vertebrae locked to resist compression, and skulls detached from shoulders for freer movement. Every redesign carried a cost: slower swimming, heavier frames, greater energy demands, yet survival favored endurance over grace. The sea had shaped fluidity, land demanded structure. To rise was to compromise, but also to invent. Within these experiments lay the blueprint of all future vertebrates: the limb's five-fold pattern, the mobile neck, the spinal curve. Innovation still echoed in every stride and gesture we take today. The world around them was equally in flux. Devonian coastlines teemed with primitive forests. Archaeopteris, the first true tree, spread canopies over marshy soil. Ferns and horsetails thickened the air with spores and shade. Insects skittered across the surface. Millipedes coiled in detritus, and scorpions hunted between roots. For the first time, ecosystems on land grew vertically, building layers of complexity that mirrored coral reefs below. The amphibious pioneers were not alone. They emerged into a world already alive with texture and opportunity, one that demanded exploration. By the Devonian's end, these amphibious lineages, Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, Tulipeton, had refined the balance between water and air. Acanthostega still carried gills and fin rays, but its eight-fingered limbs hinted at propulsion beyond swimming. Ichthyostega, heavier and more rigid, could brace its torso against gravity, dragging itself short distances across mud. Together, they represent not a single leap, but a spectrum of solutions, each organism an iteration in evolution's long conversation with physics. The fossil record preserves these forms not as triumphs, but as attempts, each one testing the weight of the world. As these creatures ventured farther, their senses transformed with them. Eyes, once adapted for dim light and refraction, learned to track in air, their focus sharpening across distance. Ears evolved from pressure sensors to chambers of resonance, attuned to vibrations carried through air instead of water. Even the skin, once a permeable membrane, thickened, trading absorption for protection. The cost was isolation. The connection to water's constant exchange was lost. Yet in that separation came awareness, the first recognition of environment as something to be crossed, not simply inhabited, and in this recognition, movement gained meaning. The act of crawling from one pool to another became migration, then territory, then intent. The earliest tetrapods traced routes through flooded forests, their tracks intersecting with those of arthropods and fish. Some returned to the water to breed, others lingered longer on land. Evolution, once confined to oceanic depths, now unfolded across continents, driven by droughts, floods, and the endless negotiation between dependence and independence. Each step across the mud was an act of transformation: bone, learning, rhythm, lung meeting air, eye meeting light. What began as an experiment became inevitability. Life had not only reached the land, it had found its stance beneath the sun. The mud cooled around its imprint, the echo of a motion that would never fade. Gravity had found a new companion. In every vertebra and joint, the sea still whispered, but now it walked. Forests of shadow and light. After the crawl onto land came silence, then the whisper of leaves. In the late Devonian, around 380 million years ago, Earth began to wear a cloak of forests. The first trees, Archaeopteris, Warteza, and their kin stretched upward, pushing through mist and light. With their ascent, the planet's skin began to breathe differently. Oxygen levels rose. Shadows lengthened, and in that structure, the planet learned stillness. Not the stillness of dormancy, but of long, slow exchange between light and air. One grasped the air, the other the earth, limbs and roots in quiet symmetry. What had been loose sediments along riverbanks transformed into stable ground as roots wove networks of organic cables beneath the surface. Soil formed, not just silt or sand, but a living structure. This changed everything. Water no longer rushed unrestrained to the sea, but lingered, filtered, fed. The Earth's surface chemistry was rewritten. Carbon that once cycled freely through the air was drawn down into the earth, buried beneath decaying bark and leaf litter. Over time, these underground vaults stored vast amounts of carbon, cooling the global climate. Glaciers flickered at high latitudes, subtle but unprecedented. The Devonian Earth, once dominated by shallow seas and coral reefs, was becoming a planet of continents, its pulse slowed by root and rain. Above the ferns, spores drifted like breath. This was a planet learning to reproduce in the air. Early forests, spread not by seeds but by spores, carried through wind and rain millions of tiny chances for continuity. In vast stands of lycopsids and ferns, reproduction became a choreography of mist and motion. Evolution was experimenting with complexity. Soon, seeds would appear small, protected vessels that allowed life to venture farther inland into the drier interiors of continents. In those seeds lay independence. No longer bound to water for reproduction, plants could colonize uplands and floodplains alike. Each adaptation was a negotiation between air and endurance. Forests did not simply grow, they engineered the possibility of permanence. Deep within the forest gloom, chemistry changed first. The decomposition of fallen wood, a process unknown to earlier worlds, introduced a new stage in the carbon story. Fungi evolved enzymes capable of breaking down lignin, the tough polymer that made wood possible. Yet in these early epochs, chemistry was incomplete. Much of the wood did not decay quickly, it accumulated. Over millions of years, these deposits would become coal, the compressed memory of forests long vanished. The Devonian air, now rich with oxygen, shimmered with volatility the planet had never known. Every breath of the wind carried a trace of imbalanced fuel in search of a spark. In the fossil record, evidence of roots reveals an unseen revolution. The Rhynie chert, a Scottish window into this age, preserves entire miniature ecosystems, roots, spores, fungi entombed in silica. Within these fossils lies proof of the first mycorrhizal symbioses. Fungi and plants forming alliances that allowed nutrient exchange between soil and life. This was not competition, but cooperation written into biology. The mycelial threads acted as conduits, delivering phosphorus and nitrogen in exchange for sugars born of sunlight. With such partnerships, forests expanded rapidly, drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide and cooling the global climate further. The Devonian, once warm and humid, entered an age of contrast, lush equatorial canopies and frozen extremes. The planet's breath had deepened, but its pulse grew irregular. Across the floodplains, water and wood met in intricate choreography. Seasonal floods carved channels through forest roots, leaving behind wetlands alive with decay. Amphibians lurked among submerged roots, insects rose from damp leaf litter, and crustaceans patrolled the silty margins. In these swamps, oxygen production reached its zenith. Measurements from carbon isotopes in Devonian sediments suggest oxygen concentrations approaching 25%, enough to alter physiology, ignite new metabolic pathways, and set the stage for gigantism. The air itself became an evolutionary pressure, rewarding those who could breathe and burn more efficiently. Then came the fire, Earth's first true flame. High oxygen concentrations made the world combustible. Lightning, striking a dry fern or a fallen branch, could ignite vast stretches of woodland. For the first time in Earth's history, flame became part of the ecological cycle. Charcoal deposits from this period record these infernos to black fingerprints of transformation. Fire consumed and renewed, pruning the forests and fertilizing the soil with ash. It was destruction as equilibrium, chaos as regulation. And through this new rhythm of burning and rebirth, ecosystems adapted. Some plants developed fire-resistant bark or seeds that germinated only after heat. Life, once fragile in the face of catastrophe, began to anticipate it, to fold destruction into its design. Past the reach of firelight, the forests persisted, remaking the air they had once composed. As continents drifted closer to the equator, rainfall intensified, feeding the great coal swamps that would one day form the Carboniferous seams beneath modern ground. Rivers meandered through jungles of towering lycopsids, some over 30 meters tall. The atmosphere thickened with humidity and oxygen. Insects flourished to enormous sizes. Forests became engines of weather, pulling moisture inland, darkening the skies, and stabilizing global temperatures. The ashes settled, and in their quiet, the world waited for new heirs, those born to the sky and shielded in scale. Insects grew to astonishing dimensions in the oxygen-rich air dragonflies, with wings spanning nearly a meter, millipedes longer than a human. Amphibians diversified, some venturing farther from water with each generation. The earth was no longer defined by oceans but by canopy and light, by the rhythm of photosynthesis and decay. Beneath the filtered sun, life prepared for another leap from those that crawled among roots to those that would rise into the air. The age of forests was giving way to an age of movement, of armour and wing. Empires of the swamp, through the haze of an oxygen-rich dawn, the world steamed with life. The Carboniferous Earth, 300 million years ago, was a planet of breath and shadow, a time when air itself was thick enough to feed giants. Vast forests sprawled across the equator, their roots buried in black mud that exhaled methane and moisture. The sky hung heavy with vapour, and every leaf glistened beneath the filtered sun. It was a world built of green and gold, where the very act of living filled the air with oxygen. And in that invisible abundance, new empires were born. Insects rose first, their wings vast and translucent, slicing through the heavy air. Meganeura, a dragonfly with a wingspan wider than a raven's, glided over fern canopies in deliberate strokes. Below, swarms of mayflies danced in sunshafts, their brief lives spent in ritualized ascent. Centipedes and beetles skittered across decaying trunks, while millipedes the length of a man Arthropleura wound their way through damp corridors of roots. These creatures were architects of decomposition, recyclers of a forest too lush for its own balance. They breathed through spiracles, their open systems flooded with oxygen, and as that oxygen thickened, so too did their bodies grow gravity, yielding to chemistry. Below them, amphibians reigned in the shallows, hunters of patience and ambush. The great labyrinthodonts crouched beside pools, eyes breaking the surface like dark jewels. Their limbs, neither fully aquatic nor terrestrial, moved with slow, deliberate power. Each strike was silent, an explosion of muscle and suction. Eriops, with its sprawling stance and wide skull, patrolled the edges of stagnant water, its nostrils lifting above the scum to draw a breath. These creatures were heirs to Tiktaalik and Acanthostega, their bones already shaped by gravity's pull. Yet here, they were masters feeding on the insects that filled the air, keeping balance in a system on the verge of saturation. The air itself fed this empire. Oxygen, once a trace gas in early atmospheres, now fills nearly 35% of the sky. Fires could ignite with a spark. A single lightning strike could set entire forests ablaze, charring millions of years of stored carbon. Yet it was this same chemical generosity that made life vast and slow and strange. Giant dragonflies beat their wings in slow motion. Respiration was effortless. Amphibians grew to sizes that modern air could not sustain. Even decay struggled. Oxygen-fed fungi and bacteria could not keep pace with the rain of dead wood. What they failed to decompose became coal, entombed in the deep swamps, the compressed memory of ancient air. Among the ferns, ecosystems thrived in layers: canopy, understory, swamp, and silt. The lycopsid trees, Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, rose over 30 meters tall, their bark patterned in diamond scars. Beneath them, seed ferns and horsetails wove dense undergrowth, their spores drifting like smoke. Streams meandered through this verdant maze, feeding deltas rich in detritus. Each fallen log hosted its own forest fungi, sprouting from rot, arthropods tunneling through decay. The world had never known such vertical complexity. It was a living cathedral of moisture and motion. Yet in that intricate layering lay its fragility, every species dependent on the swamp's steady pulse. Fossils tell the story of this abundance in exquisite detail. Coal seams preserve flattened trunks of calamites and imprints of lepidodendron bark, while shale deposits reveal the fragile wings of insects long vanished. In the Carbondale Formation of Illinois, entire ecosystems are captured mid-collapse: fern fronds, dragonfly wings, amphibian tracks hardened into stone. Paleontologists read these impressions like scripture, a record of flourishing, of respiration and ruin. Even the carbon locked within the seams carries isotopic whispers of ancient photosynthesis, marking the rise and fall of oxygen over millions of years. Every layer is a time capsule of exuberance, a reminder that growth unchecked becomes its own undoing. But excess carries fragility. The same forests that built the air began to suffocate beneath their own remains. As swamps deepened, water stagnated, cutting off the oxygen that once sustained roots. Vast peat beds drowned under their own accumulation. Fires raged, consuming what the swamps could no longer bury. Even the air, once a gift, became a burden. Elevated oxygen-fueled combustion, lightning transformed paradise into ash. The ecosystem that had mastered balance began to sway. Across the continents, tectonic collisions lifted new mountains, altering wind and rainfall. The assembly of Pangaea reshaped the world. Continents converged, folding the landscape into ridges that caught clouds and stole the rains. The humid equatorial band that had nurtured forests for millions of years began to shrink. Inland regions dried, their wetlands shrinking to isolated basins. What had been a world of green began to darken, its lushness giving way to cracked earth and shifting dunes. The amphibians that once thrived in every pool were forced to retreat toward the last remaining deltas, oases of life, surrounded by dust. By the close of the Carboniferous, these swamps, once unbroken, began to wither. Dragonflies still glided through the haze, but their kingdom was waning. Gigantism faded as oxygen levels declined. The great millipedes disappeared, their descendants shrinking with each generation. Insects adapted, smaller, faster, their wings folding neatly for efficiency. Amphibians grew thicker skins, stronger limbs. Forests thinned, the chorus of croaks and chirps quieted. The world exhaled, its fever of abundance broken by geology's slow hand. Amid the shrinking wetlands, life adapted again, scales thickening, lungs growing stronger, skin learning to resist the air. From this crucible of change rose the first true reptiles, creatures that could carry their worlds within dry eggs, sealed lungs, independence from the swamp. The reign of humidity was ending, replaced by endurance. Yet in the soft mud where forests once stood, impressions of wings and footprints still lingered, echoes of the Carboniferous dream. The world had feasted on air and green and shadow, and now, as the continents joined and the skies grew drier, life prepared for a harsher dominion. The age of abundance was fading, but evolution was only sharpening its tools. The age of reptiles begins in shadow. With the fading of the swamp's golden age, a quieter world unfolded, one of cracked earth, pale skies, and retreating waters. The humid reign of amphibians was ending. Vast wetlands that had once echoed with croaks and the flutter of giant insects began to shrink, their pools evaporating under a changing sun. Oxygen levels, once high enough to feed dragonflies the size of hawks, fell steadily. Forests thinned, leaving ghostly stumps in places that had once pulsed with life. In the silence that followed, the stage was cleared for something new, creatures that would not return to the water when the rain stopped. Life adjusted to the slow rhythm of droughts and seasons, where survival no longer meant abundance, but endurance through scarcity. Amphibians, chained to ponds that vanished with the dry months, withered in the heat. Only those with bodies sealed against the air, lungs refined for breathing dryness, and scales that shimmered like armor could thrive. Reptiles, the first of their kind, emerged from this crucible. They were not sudden inventions, but careful inheritances, born from ancestors that had already learned to lift their heads from the shallows and fill their lungs with air. Yet these new creatures carried something radical: autonomy. The link to water, the ancient chain that had bound vertebrate life since its beginning, was finally broken. Within the delicate walls of a leathery egg, evolution found its sanctuary, a portable sea sealed against desiccation. The amniotic egg was a world in miniature, an inner ocean surrounded by protective membranes where the embryo could grow safely away from rivers and ponds. Its shell, porous enough for oxygen but resilient against dryness, allowed life to travel inland for the first time. The innovation rewrote every ecological boundary. A reptile could lay its clutch on dunes, under roots, or in the shelter of fallen logs, anywhere warmth and air could reach. This freedom from the tides was not merely biological, it was existential. Life had discovered permanence in a world that no longer offered it freely. Fossil beds in Nova Scotia and Scotland reveal slender-bodied reptiles, their ribs hardened, their bones sculpted for the long silence of dry ground. In the sandstone cliffs of Joggins, Canada, the impressions of early reptiles, Hylonomus and Paleozoic, rest within the hollow trunks of ancient lycopsid trees. These fossils, dating back over 310 million years, capture a moment of quiet revolution. Hylonomus, scarcely longer than a man's hand, already possessed all the hallmarks of its descendants: clawed toes, a strong spine, a ribcage enclosing well-developed lungs. It did not need to bask by the pond's edge or retreat beneath the surface. The air, once an enemy, had become its home. Its kind would multiply, diversifying across the continents, like seeds scattered by shifting winds. Continents, once wrapped in forest canopies, drifted into arid belts, and monsoon rains grew rare as Pangaea's heart turned to dust. The Carboniferous period gave way to the Permian, and the planet's climate began its long descent into instability. Great coal forests collapsed into extinction as drought expanded across the equator. Rivers slowed, and inland seas retreated, leaving behind salt flats that shimmered in the sun. Yet in these deserts, reptiles thrived. Their scaly skin conserved water, their efficient lungs extracted oxygen from thin air, and their hearts, divided into chambers, pumped with precision unmatched by their amphibian kin. The Earth's pulse had changed, its rhythm beating slower, deeper, and drier. Every breath drew thinner air, every heartbeat laboured beneath a sky stripped of moisture, a planet learning to breathe differently. Atmospheric oxygen levels, once exceeding 30%, fell closer to modern proportions, reshaping metabolism and muscle. Fire became rarer, decomposition slowed, ecosystems adjusted to scarcity. The decline in oxygen favoured those who could endure it: reptiles with efficient blood circulation, cold-blooded metabolisms, and lungs optimized for reduced air density. Evolution rewarded conservatism over extravagance. The lush exuberance of the Carboniferous was replaced by the cautious resilience of the Permian. The world was no longer a greenhouse, but a forge, and in its heat, new designs took shape. Larger predators, tougher hides, sharper senses. Over the plains of early Pangaea, forms both strange and familiar appeared: Captorhinus, Protorotherus, and Petrolacosaurus, early amniotes tracing the lineage that would diverge into mammals, reptiles, and birds. The distinction between synapsid and diapsid, between the lineage of fur and the lineage of scales, began here. Captorhinus, small and lizard-like, sported multiple rows of teeth for crushing tough vegetation, while Petrolacosaurus, slender and agile, darted between rocks in pursuit of insects. Behind these differences lay a deeper innovation: the rearrangement of skull openings that allowed more efficient jaw muscles. Bite by bite, the architecture of future empires was being built. The ground itself testified to their success. Trackways found in the red beds of Texas and Germany reveal organized movement reptiles walking with deliberate, alternating strides, tails lifted clear of the dust. Unlike the sprawling gaits of amphibians, these creatures moved with confidence and rhythm, their spines flexing to balance each step. It was not simply movement, but mastery. Locomotion that anticipated the grace of lizards, the speed of dinosaurs, the patience of crocodiles. In every print lay the geometry of future evolution. But this was not an age of ease. The forest's fall unleashed carbon into the air, while the continent's collision wrinkled mountain chains that altered wind and rainfall. Glaciation flickered at the poles even as equatorial heat burned dry the soil. The Earth teetered between extremes, an unstable system oscillating between flood and famine. Yet reptiles endured, not through strength alone, but adaptability. Their eggs weathered the droughts. Their bodies withstood temperature swings. They were no longer bound by climate, but partners in its unpredictability. The age of reliance had ended. Independence had begun. In deeper strata, the first hints of future lineages took shape. Para-reptiles with armoured shells, the procolophenoids, patrolled the edges of ancient deltas. The synapsid ancestors of mammals, such as Dimetrodon, evolved within the same ecosystems, displaying the great sail that channeled sunlight and heat regulation. Predator and prey, desert and oasis, were all now enclosed within a single continent's breadth. Pangaea, vast and volatile, became the testing ground for resilience. Beneath its vast skies, life was learning how to survive itself. Even as reptiles rose to dominance, the earth below them stirred with unease, a reminder that every triumph carries the echo of coming loss. Magma churned in hidden chambers, and the air thickened with gases that whispered of endings yet to come. The planet's crust trembled with potential catastrophe, though no creature could sense it. For now, the reptiles basked in their victory, oblivious to the shadow gathering beneath their feet. The age of drought had given birth to endurance, and endurance to empire. But beneath that stillness, the future was already shifting. Inferno at the end of time. The late Permian world had fallen into a creeping silence before the earth began to stir with unease. What had been a planet of thriving reptiles and sprawling forests now rested upon an invisible fault of pressure and time. The continents, fused into Pangaea, strained under their own weight, their interiors baking in heat and drought. Life, so newly confident on land, stood unaware that the ground beneath it was preparing its own undoing. Even the winds seemed slower than usual, heavy with dust and the scent of decay, as if the planet itself was holding its breath before catastrophe. In the heart of what would become Siberia, the crust split open like a wound that would not close. For nearly 2 million years, magma surged upward in relentless waves, flooding the surface with basalt and ash. Each eruption released torrents of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane, saturating the skies in a toxic haze. The Siberian Traps, a province of fire spanning over 7 million square kilometers, reshaped the face of the planet more completely than any war of flesh or fang. Lava fountains hundreds of meters high tore through the air, turning night into molten daylight, while rivers of rock carved new valleys across a wounded land. The devastation was not limited to sight or sound. It was chemical, global, and cumulative. Volcanic gases reacted with the atmosphere to form sulfuric aerosols that dimmed the sun, plunging the world into brief volcanic winters, followed by feverish warming as greenhouse gases accumulated. In marine sediments, scientists today find the signature of this imbalance, a sharp negative delta to the power of 13C excursion, evidence of massive carbon injections that flipped Earth's climate system into chaos. Throughout the breadth of the supercontinent, the air thickened with the stench of burning forests. Rivers ran black with ash, and acid rain ate through soil that had once been rich with life. Pollen grains from this period showed deformities, twisted, fused, and poisoned before they could bear the next generation. Oceans, already burdened with runoff and heat, began to suffocate. As volcanic gases dissolved into seawater, they drove chemical reactions that robbed the depths of oxygen, turning entire basins anoxic. In many regions, hydrogen sulfide accumulated to lethal levels, a process known as eucinia, staining the water green and purple with bacterial blooms. The seas that had once nursed trilobites, coral reefs, and ammonites now became stagnant, lifeless tombs. The chain reaction extended upward into the skies themselves. Methane released from thawing permafrost accelerated global warming, pushing temperatures beyond thresholds any complex life could withstand. Geological evidence from carbon isotopes and oxygen proxies tells of a world that heated by over 8 degrees Celsius in a geological instant, an inferno without precedent. Forests collapsed under relentless droughts. Ferns and conifers gave way to barren landscapes of dust. Even the insects, once the quiet rulers of the swamps, vanished from the record, victims of a planet no longer breathable. In this crucible of chaos, the great ecosystems of the Paleozoic unraveled. Amphibians, still tethered to moist environments, disappeared almost entirely. Reptiles, though hardier, suffered losses that pushed even the most resilient species to the brink. In the oceans, 96% of marine life perished. Brachiopods, crinoids, trilobites, and entire coral lineages faded into extinction. The diversity that had taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble was undone in a span so short that it would seem, in deep time, like a blink. Sedimentary layers from this era bear silent testimony. Black shales laced with pyrite, charcoal traces from global wildfires, and iridium dust hinting at atmospheric collapse. Even in ancient carbonate rocks, bubbles of trapped gas tell of rising CO, 2 levels, and acidification that dissolved shell-forming organisms from the inside out. In some deposits, the presence of nickel-rich aerosols points to a chilling cause. Volcanic nickel emissions, feeding methane-producing microbes, amplifying greenhouse feedbacks until the biosphere tore itself apart. The fossil record thins to near nothing. Whole ecosystems vanish mid-sequence, replaced by desolate strata known to geologists as the Great Dying. Even microbial mats, the simplest forms of organization, retreated into extremophile niches, salt flats, acidic lakes, and deep-sea vents that hissed with the planet's wounded breath. It was a purification by fire, a reduction of complexity so severe that even the planet's oxygen cycle faltered. For a time, it seemed Earth had forgotten how to live. Yet, amid the ruin, patterns of recovery began, slow, hidden, almost imperceptible. Certain burrowing species survived in the shadows, enduring the poisoned air by retreating underground. In South Africa's Karoo Basin, fossils of Lystrosaurus, a sturdy, tusked survivor, dominate post-extinction layers, a testament to life's tenacity. Cyanobacteria returned first to the shallows, staining the edges of evaporating seas with mats of green and red. These microbial pioneers restored the carbon balance molecule by molecule, laying the first faint foundations for the ecosystems to come. In China's Meishan section, scientists trace these earliest signs of renewal stromatolite reefs rising where complex coral systems had once stood, marking the slow chemical reawakening of the oceans. Every cataclysm carries a strange clarity, an awareness of fragility so vast it borders on reverence. The Permian extinction was not a single blow, but a symphony of collapse, eruptions, heat, chemical breakdown, and feedback loops, each echoing into the next. In its wake, the biosphere shrank to a fraction of what it had been, yet the planet endured. Beneath the ash, seeds of adaptation persisted, ready to rewrite the story of life once more. And so, silence returned, but not the silence of lifelessness. It was the breath drawn before renewal, the still pause between extinction and emergence. The earth, scarred and dimmed, turned once again toward the possibility of light. From death came the raw material of creation, and from devastation, the promise of rebirth. Ashes to evolution, the legacy of the Paleozoic. When the fires dimmed and the choking clouds began to thin, the earth exhaled for the first time in millions of years. What had been an inferno of collapsing ecosystems now lay silent under grey skies, its continents stripped to stone and dust. The once living planet was reduced to the bare mechanics of survival, heat bleeding from its crust, carbon heavy in its air, and oceans turned to stagnant chemical stews. Yet in that silence, something endured. The pulse of life, faint, fractured, but not extinguished, stirred again within the ruins. Over millions of years, that fragile pulse grew steadier. The atmosphere slowly cleared as volcanic fury subsided, allowing sunlight to reclaim the surface. Cyanobacteria and algae returned to the shallows, spreading oxygen back into the seas molecule by molecule. Their work was invisible, yet transformative. The chemical imbalance that had nearly suffocated the planet began to tilt once more towards stability. In these microscopic frontiers, the foundations of future worlds were quietly restored, as photosynthesis reclaimed its dominion over air and ocean alike. Encased in the debris of a dying era, the first survivors of the Permian apocalypse emerged. Among them were Lystrosaurus squat, tusked herbivores that roamed the barren floodplains in herds, feeding on sparse vegetation that clung to muddy soils. Their fossils are found across what was once Pangaea, evidence of a creature both unremarkable and extraordinary. Unremarkable in form, but extraordinary in endurance. With barrel-shaped bodies and simple diets, they thrived in desolation, dominating the early Triassic landscape where few others could persist. There reign nearly 90% of terrestrial vertebrate fossils from this period stands as a testament to evolution's ruthless efficiency in crisis. In the shallow seas of the early Triassic, life reassembled itself with hesitant grace. Ammonoids, once devastated, began to spiral anew through the waters. Conodonts, eel-like vertebrates, multiplied in diversity, marking the slow rebound of marine food webs. Coral reefs, those fragile architectures of life, were absent for millions of years, yet microbial reefs rose in their place, built by cyanobacteria and other simple organisms. Geochemical evidence from carbonate sediments shows how oxygen levels in the oceans rose in rhythmic pulses, as though the sea itself were relearning how to breathe. Across the parched continents, new ecosystems took shape under the searing sun. Rivers once buried in ash cut fresh paths through soft basalt, carrying nutrients to valleys where ferns and seed plants reappeared. Early gymnosperms spread, their deep roots stabilizing soils and drawing water from depths unreachable to shallower predecessors. The recovery of vegetation altered the atmosphere again, pulling carbon dioxide back from dangerous heights and cooling the planet's fevered air. It was a world in recovery, but also in transformation, every survivor reshaping the stage for what evolution would soon attempt next. From the survivors came innovation. In the burrows of parched floodplains, small synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, endured heat and drought with remarkable adaptability. Fossilized remains of Thranaxodon show evidence of diaphragms and differentiated teeth, features that hinted at a more advanced metabolism and the seeds of warm-bloodedness. Nearby, early reptiles, known as archosaurs, distant kin to both crocodiles and dinosaurs, began to diversify, experimenting with posture, gait, and predation. Evolution, no longer rebuilding what was lost, had begun to experiment with what could be. By tracing the fossils left in red sandstones and black shales, scientists see the slow architecture of recovery unfold. Trace fossils reveal burrows, trackways, and feeding marks, proof that life was once again disturbing the sediment, oxygenating the soil, and creating niches for others to follow. Isotopic studies from these layers record a steady climb in oxygen levels and a decline in carbon imbalance. The data tell a story not of sudden resurrection, but of 10 million years of persistence of a biosphere teaching itself how to be alive again. As ecosystems reassembled, so too did competition, predation, and symbiosis, the forces that drive complexity. Amphibians, though reduced, returned to the waterways, joined by fish whose fins now hinted at future limbs. Insects diversified once more, spreading pollen among primitive conifers and cycads. The food webs that had collapsed into simplicity began to branch again, each connection more intricate than the last. This era, born of scarcity, became one of invention. Every adaptation was a gamble, each mutation a fragile act of defiance against the memory of extinction. The surface told one story. The mantle beneath was writing another, a shift already underway. Pangaea's vast interior remained dry and hostile, but at its margins, tectonic stress brewed new possibilities. Volcanoes still lingered, but their activity waned into a slow simmer rather than a cataclysm. Over time, plate movements, fractured coastlines, and seeded shallow basins where new marine life could thrive. In these expanding ecological theatres, reptiles would grow larger, faster, and more ambitious, their lineage poised to inherit a world remade by fire and time. At last, evolution found momentum again. The survivors of the Permian did not merely rebuild the biosphere, they redefined it. The ecosystems of the Triassic were unlike anything that had come before. Dynamic, mobile, and filled with new predators and prey. Out of collapse emerged creativity. The amniotic egg, the erect gait, and the warm-blooded metabolism, all of these evolutionary innovations, refined in hardship, would echo through every age that followed. The legacy of the Paleozoic was not its destruction, but its endurance. Through loss, evolution learned resilience. Through silence, it discovered adaptation. The species that crawled from the ruins carried within them the genetic whispers of worlds-long vanished codes that would one day shape dinosaurs, mammals, and even us. Beneath the memory of extinction, the Earth had already chosen renewal, so the planet turned, slowly and surely, toward a new horizon. What had once been an age of trilobites and forests was now a crucible of experimentation, where the survivors of catastrophe became the architects of tomorrow. From the memory of ruin to the promise of renewal, the Earth once more found rhythm, a turning sphere ready for another age. The Paleozoic ends not with silence, but with transformation, a planet reborn through struggle and fire. From the first spark of life to the fall of ancient empires, Earth learned resilience, writing its endurance into every living cell. The continents that burned would one day cradle forests again. The oceans that emptied would teem once more with light. Deep time reminds us that even in ruin, creation waits. The story of life is not one of survival alone, but of becoming. If you love exploring Earth's forgotten worlds, subscribe for more journeys into deep time.